Welcome, everyone, to ELI Talks on Air. Today we're with Esther Kustanowitz, and Esther is someone whose work I have followed for years and years, and I'm so excited to talk to you about all sorts of things today, Esther. So for those of you who are watching us live, you're welcome to submit any questions or comments as we go, and we'll entertain those throughout the next 40 minutes or so as we're discussing things with Esther. So just as a bit of background, ELI Talks are wonderful talks that are created with different speakers who have big ideas that are curated very carefully. You can find more at elitalks.org. And on Facebook at facebook.com/ELI Talks video. There's a whole new set of ELI Talks that have just come out and been published that I hope you will watch and enjoy. We might mention a couple of those today. ELI On Air is a weekly interactive broadcast in which we speak with interesting people from across the Jewish spectrum on issues of Jewish engagement, literacy, and identity. I'm Lisa Colton from C3 Communications, and I will be your host and conversationalist with Esther today. And you can submit your questions online through the Q&A feature on this live video chat or on Twitter using the hashtag ELI Talks. So, Esther, our fantastic guest for the day, has written and consulted for many Jewish organizations over many years. She's been quite involved with ROI in the past and worked with the Next Gen Engagement Initiative at the Jewish Federation of Greater Los Angeles. She's currently working at Pictures from the Fringe, a production company in Los Angeles where she lives, and she's the director of digital content and working as an editor around their stories as well. Esther blends this fantastic integration of technology and writing and journalism, humor and seriousness, and blends her personal and professional lives quite gracefully, I would say, and is really well known across the Jewish community as somebody who just puts herself out there with a lot of honesty and really inspires conversation and deep engagement. So, Esther, that's where I'd love to start and ask you how you do it. You really have a knack for building community and getting people to engage in really meaningful conversations, doing it all online and virtually. So what are the kind of strategies that you use, or what are your personality traits that you think make that so successful?
Thank you for that question, Lisa, and thank you for having me here on ELI Talks. It's great to be here and talking with all of you. I mean all of you, not just Lisa Colton, who's amazing, and the staff of ELI Talks, but everybody else who might be listening either online live or in the future, as this will be a recorded broadcast. So I thank you for that wonderful introduction, and it makes me feel really good to hear it because I think ever since I started writing, I've really been writing from a place of personal honesty and exploration. So for me, like, I write about the things that are important to me, but if they're just my own story, then it's just it doesn't serve a larger purpose. So for me, I've always felt like to write about something where it might be pertinent to me at this particular moment in time, but to know that, you know, I'm not the only person in the world to ever have these feelings, or to ever feel alone, or to ever feel grief, or to ever feel happiness, or ever to look at something with a little bit of a sarcastic edge, you know, to really just, you know, skewer something a little bit in terms of a satirical bent. That, you know, all of those traditions are things that I try to incorporate. But throughout everything that I've written, I feel is representative of a part of myself that's true and authentic. And this is even not in the bio. This is like pre-bio. But I spent a lot of time in New York as a writer and freelancer. And during that time, I had a column in the Jewish Week, the New York Jewish Week, about Jewish single life, and that became like a real interesting, like, fulcrum of conversation. And I was very aware that it wasn't just me out there in that pool of Jewish singles trying to create meaning. And that particular column wasn't about, like, I went on this date and it was horrible and blah, blah, blah. That wasn't the focus. It was always about this intersection of Jewish life and the demographic that I was in, and how could those two things coexist in a way that's helpful, beneficial, nurturing for all parties concerned. So it's not necessarily that my writing is about, pointing a finger at anybody and saying this needs to be done better or you did this wrong, but really about trying to raise awareness of conversations and people who maybe aren't necessarily being seen or addressed in some of the current conversations in contemporary life in general and in Jewish contemporary life specifically. So that has kind of been my my crate that I stand on and talk about these things, whether it was Jewish single life and how the community can better support people who are single and engage them, or whether it was about Jews in their 20s and 30s not feeling so close to the establishments and wanting to connect to Jewish community in new and different ways. Or, now when I'm writing a lot about grief and consolation and comfort and trying to balance that with, a love for life and a real, appreciation for comedy and humor and the lifeboat that can provide for people who are going through something difficult. So all of those influences are things that I juggle, and I don't necessarily isolate each of them. They kind of all flow together because that's how I am in my in the way I speak with people and the way I write. And I think that people who have met me after reading my writing have said to me more often than not that they said that reading the work that I've written is just the same as talking to me. And so I think that approachability and that blend of accessibility, humor, but seriousness, and the knowledge that I bring to all of those different areas is what makes people, I hope, enjoy and maybe get something out of the things that I've written, and that it's not just me, talking about myself in a self-indulgent way.
Well, you have a really great knack for talking about your own experience with in a very poignant and authentic and transparent way, and using that experience or that example as not necessarily to generalize to the public, but to invite the public to engage around that topic as well. And you name it. It's not vague. I mean, your blog, JDaters Anonymous, was like, this is what I'm going through, and I know you guys out there are going through it too, which I just think is amazing. And I find a lot of people today have a hard time with putting themselves out with that kind of authenticity or even vulnerability. And I'm curious what you have found. Are you conscious of how much risk you take or how much you put yourself out there? And what have you learned about, the more you put yourself out there, the more comes back to you? And what's that sense of community that's built from that?
Right. Well, I think that authenticity is obviously the name of the game for writers, for content producers, for anybody who's trying to connect with somebody else. Being real really does earn more connection points, if there is such a thing. Mm-hmm. But I think that for me, I have developed a balance of putting myself out there to the degree that I'm comfortable, and then maybe a smidge over that line. But not further than that. And I will be happy to admit that there are things that I don't write about, that even though, when I was writing for the singles column and for JDaters Anonymous, which was the blog that grew out of that I've mostly abandoned because a lot of people, there's a lot of negativity around the dating space that I just wasn't really interested in engaging in regularly anymore. But when I put myself out there about these things, people said, I feel like I know everything about you. And my answer was to them, that's great that you feel connected to me, but you really don't know everything about me, because that's not my interest. My interest isn't being, completely open and naked online. That's not my goal. My goal is to share something that I'm experiencing in the hope that it reaches other people who are experiencing something similar. Maybe they have something to give to me in terms of support, and maybe I have something to give to them in terms of support. but especially as I've branched out into this whole new area of writing about grief and loss and how the community deals with it, I've definitely received so many people who have reached back to me and said, you know, you nailed it, or what you said wasn't exactly applicable, but this is what happened to me. And I think that the human condition is at its most interesting when we're sharing stories. And that is something that has kind of been a through line in everything that I've done. And when I was a little kid, I was just at my dad's house cleaning out my room, and so I found all these things that I had written over the years. And when I first started, obviously my writing was extremely derivative, mostly of mythology, and one could say even copying myths and midrashim that Jewish legends that I had heard growing up. But as I've developed, I knew I wanted to be a novelist, and that's something that I actually quickly abandoned. I didn't really feel that that was the best use of my time and my talent. I really have decided that, like, I think using the lens of personal reflection and real, like, personal narrative has been the thing that has been the most interesting to me. Hearing people's stories, how those stories intersect with and add to my own, that's been a tremendous pleasure, and that's really kind of my approach to most of these things.
I think it's great, and I think that the fact that you put yourself out there is really an invitation for other people to put themselves out there as well and have that kind of connection. And it's only when we create that opportunity for depth do we get to a richer place. And I think in our Jewish communities, whether we're in structured environments like a member of a synagogue, or less structured environments and just with our friends and family, you got to open up to go there. And I think you're modeling something really valuable.
And don't get me wrong, there are moments when I'm writing and I write something and I'm like, oh, dear God, like, is that something I should say or want to say or want in public record about myself? And I do have a very strong inner critic and editor who sometimes hesitates before pushing publish. I don't think that's a bad thing. It is a little bit of a self-censor, which, my more extreme writing colleagues would say, just, to heck with this censor, or they might say it in sharper language than that. But, they would say uncensored is art. And I'm not really trying to create art per se. I'm trying to create like a personal narrative, whatever my truth is, but it's a part of my truth, and it's not the entirety thereof. And there are times when I publish something and I say to myself, I can't believe I just published that. That's out there. And most of the time, it's not necessarily when it's something about myself. It's something when it's something about other people. So, for instance, my mother was very private about her illnesses and the process. While she was deteriorating, she didn't want a lot of attention around that, and so I'm trying to be like alternately respectful of that even now that she's gone, but also like understanding that the facts of what happened to her are part of my story as well. So trying to become comfortable with talking about her in a way that may be slightly more than she would have been comfortable with, but isn't necessarily in violation of anything that she would have considered a violation of her privacy. So that's one of the things that I think about when I'm trying to figure out whether to publish or not.
Right. So you've written on a whole bunch of different topics, from social media and pop culture and arts to the singles culture and dating and innovation in the Jewish community. You're now writing a lot about the process of grief and of loss, and you have an upcoming book tentatively titled "Nothing Helps, But This Might Help: A Guide to Loss and What Comes After." I'm curious if you could just tell us a little bit about why you felt this was a place to actually put your thoughts together in a book form, and as you're pulling these thoughts and feelings together, what's the process for you, and what's it like to engage with other people in conversations about loss and grief?
These are great questions. My mother passed away about 3 years ago. The third yard site was just in May, and I mean, as a writer, fundamentally was always going to process this through writing. There was no chance of it happening any other way. And I started actually when she was in the hospital. I started writing, and that writing is predictably just raw and very uncertain and like very emotional, even for me to read 3 years later. But I knew that like while it was happening to me, that I really hadn't had a friend or a close friend or a friend for the last several years whose parent had passed away or who had gone through something very challenging like this. And as somebody who's always, as my mother always thought of herself as a teacher, in some ways I think of myself as a purveyor of experiences that may teach other people, if not necessarily an educator in the strictest and most trained sense of the word. But as I was experiencing things, people kept asking me questions because I was writing about it and because I was being open and because they had a relationship with me that was open and honest because of the way I've written in the past. So they would ask, do you mind if I ask? And, is it okay for me to ask a question? And I just kind of wanted to give people that permission to ask, because this is something that happens to all of us at some point in our lives. We experience terrible and heartbreaking loss. And I'm starting to a little bit. But that's part of life, and the tears are part of life, and the anguish is part of life, and the joy is part of life, and the connection with community is part of life. And hopefully you have at least as much, if not more, joy than you have grief. But in the moments of grief, it can feel like that's all there is. And so to create a context and an expectation that that there is a process to not necessarily overcoming grief, but to, re-embracing life after loss, and, getting together with community, whether it's a synagogue community for some, or, a community of camp friends or people at the office, or whatever your individual community is. And then there are additional, grief-oriented communities that have popped up. There's, for instance, friends of mine co-founded a site called modernloss.com, which has a lot of articles about every potential, every possible aspect of loss and anticipatory grief and dealing with grief and estranged grief, and the technical aspects of how to deal with an estate, and like everything that you would want to know. So that's one site that has been a tremendous resource for me. And also there's a site called thedinnerparty.org, which is basically small dinner parties in various cities across the United States that get together, and everybody who's at the meal has been through a traumatic loss, has been through a significant loss. So the people could come from all over the place, but that's the one thing that binds you, and it's the one thing you don't have to worry about stumbling across in a conversation, because it's already out there. So there are a lot of ways to connect to community after loss, and I've been really grateful to connect to a lot of them. In terms of how people are reacting, I think that again, there have been a lot of taboos around talking about grief in the community at large. It's death is very isolated and happens, unless it's really traumatic and sudden. It often happens in a hospital. Like, you don't see it, you don't really touch it at all, and there are parts of that I'm actually okay with. But the reality is that it really takes the experience and puts it aside and says that, even in Jewish life, there's shiva, which is 7 days. There's a 30-day period called shloshim. Then there's an 11-month period of saying Kaddish, and then at the end of the year of mourning, your various mourning restrictions are lifted, and you're expected to just transition back into regular life. But it's not that cut and dry. It's not like at 12 months. It's not like at 12 months you are cured and you can get back to normal, or your suspension is over and you're back in the world. And so it's much easier for people who know that there's a Jewish process, at least to this year of mourning, to understand the year, and then once the year is over, they go back to treating you regular. And while it's good to be treated like a normal human being who hasn't been afflicted by a tragedy, and to be invited to things, you're not always in the mood for it, quite frankly, because psychological healing and the progress is different for every person. So, like, I know people who were in a year of mourning now and who are grieving in their own way that is very different from the way I observed a year of mourning. They might be going to concerts, which I didn't do. They might be happy to go to a party 2 months after a parent dies, which I certainly was in no shape to do. So I understand that everybody kind of goes through it in a different way. And I just finished writing a chapter for the book, and Nothing Helps But This Might Help is just one of those titles that has stuck with me since the week of Shiva, because people were always trying to help, but also acknowledging that really at the end of the day, one thing that could change the situation is not in anyone's power. So the idea that everybody wants to help, acknowledges that it probably won't help, but then tries anyway, I think is like a really optimistic message. And I think that that's really one of the things that has been the most helpful for me is, like, if somebody acknowledges, again, acknowledging the individuality of a given loss, and then but then tries to help anyway, like not to make it go away and smooth it over like you would like a rough patch on a cake where you would just like smooth it over with icing and it's all good. Like, that's not the way it works, but it's nice that they brought a cake, so that's kind of nice to engage with.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about any observations or differences or contrasts between your kind of physical in-person community, people you see on a regular basis in Los Angeles, versus a virtual community of people either that you know at a distance or maybe you only know through your blog or social media?
Right.
And for you, going through this kind of experience and knowing the multiple places you've lived and the multiple media through which you engage with people online, in person, etc. What is community? Like, when you get to that place of really needing support and community, how do you draw on those different kinds of community, and can you compare and contrast what each is good for, or how you tap into it, or how people can support you?
Right. Thank you for that. I think it's a complicated question. There's a lot of people today who think that online community or virtual community is an actual community. That actual community is all built in person. And I do a lot of speaking engagements, some of them with you, about social media and this, kind of like the emergent social networks and how they transform communications in today's world. And I almost always get a question of, don't you think it's terrible? And of course, this is not an actual question. This is one of the famous statement questions that we deal with, especially in the Jewish world at conferences, which is, don't you think it's terrible that people only connect online these days and aren't interested in connecting offline? And first of all, that entire question is just so full of where do I start to dissect how wrong that question is? But I understand where it comes from. It comes from this fear of people only connecting through a computer. But as we're doing right now, this is a great way to connect through a computer, and it's I think superior than to talking to you on the phone, where we can't see each other and connect and smile at each other and nod and all of that great stuff. I do think that the online is a supplement for, and in some cases a connective tissue between in-person connections. But in today's world, I'm very grateful and thankful to have connections in dozens of countries around the world. The reality is I'm not going to meet most of them for coffee every week, but I can connect with them through Facebook and Twitter and just an email here and there. And the geographical boundaries matter less these days because there are more opportunities to connect, which also has challenges, obviously, that that you connect with so many people. And I get asked this a lot because I have over 4,000 Facebook friends, and something like 7,000 people follow me on Twitter or something like that. And how deep could my connections with all of them be? And obviously, I can't have deep connections with all of them, but I can have meaningful connections and interactions with them whenever I interact. And I think that that's a level of, what is called kavanah, or like intention or intentionality, that you add to something that you're trying to connect authentically, and that builds community better. In terms of the online community versus offline community, for me, when I was grieving, when I was in my year of mourning and beyond, my second year of mourning, my third year of mourning, whatever you want to call it, but people have continued to reach out to me and to engage in the conversation, because I initially volleyed something out there or volunteered something, and then it becomes this thing of its own that people can then react to. And when it's something that's deeply personal, when it's something that's political or cultural, people have opinions about it and whatever, and part of those opinions are shaped by whatever populations they identify with. Like you could be a left-wing liberal, or right-wing conservative, or whatever, and you respond from that identity. But with this issue of grief, or loss, or anticipated loss, or anything like that, it touches like a more human part of all of us, because it's molecular for us. It's not, and part of it is, of course, how does your community support or not support that enough? How do the people who are around you support that or not support that enough? But those kinds of connections, I think, are very real and very powerful, because they're raw, because people who haven't been through it can be sympathetic, but they can't be empathetic. And that does draw a line in terms of how people can support you. And the chapter that I just wrote this weekend was, well, actually, I rewrote that chapter this weekend, about how when you've been through something like this, everything looks different, and it's like you're looking through a special pair of glasses that people who haven't been through this loss don't see. And it has to do with understanding mortality and seeing things as limited, and alternately, like either wanting to embrace everything or embrace nothing, and usually someplace in the middle. So it's a very complicated perspective to take with you into the world, and it's important to know that there are other people who are seeing it that way too, even if you can't see them on the street because they're not wearing something that looks like a Google Glass, but it's really like for people who've been through Google loss. I don't know. Is that a thing? Right. I guess now. So, those kinds of things, and to look at it, the way I try to look at it, like even though like that just happened, that Google loss thing, like that's just the way I look at the world. And like, it's not to say that Google should get on that and create that right away, but it's like an importing of the other influences in my life in a way that's realistic, and that that is authentic and just kind of spontaneous. That's the way I look at things.
And when you and others put out there into the world that you've been through this experience, and therefore you see the world through those glasses, you then know who each other are in some way, and where you have that commonality and that shared experience and perspective. Rabbi Mark Cates from Congregation Beth Elohim in Brooklyn did an ELI talk recently, where he talked about loneliness, and that loneliness is one of those shared human experiences, and he even speaks about it in a little bit different terms than you have about grief, in that loneliness is something that everybody has experienced, maybe different degrees, maybe for different reasons. And he asks at the beginning of his talk, like, who has ever felt lonely? Not just when you didn't have a date on Saturday night, or when you went through divorce, or when you lost somebody, but just felt lonely. And everybody in the audience raises their hand, and you look around and you think, oh my gosh, everybody, this is a very human thing. And what do we do when we're sitting in a room, or we're part of a community where we can look around and say every single person here either is or has felt this way? And how do you put that more on the surface rather than hiding it inside, so that we can have those opportunities for connection, knowing what one another has experienced. Wendy actually asked a question about synagogues that I think maybe now is a good time to bring to the surface. She asked, why do you think synagogues have such a hard time meeting the needs of singles, bringing them into the heart of the community, which is often dominated by family and kids? And I'm curious for you to comment on that, just sort of in a general way, and then perhaps also speak to your own experience in your own synagogue community in Los Angeles.
Okay, so this issue has been something that's followed me around for the last number deleted years. So I mean, this is something that I obviously feel very strongly about. I think that singles are often viewed as a challenge or an engagement challenge or a problem or like a crisis. Oh my goodness, they're not married. What do we do with them? And I think that this is something that needs to change. I mean, I think that people have to see singles as humans, as people who aren't just pre-marriage or pre-children. Some of them may not marry, some of them may not have children, and they still have to be made to feel, and not just made to feel, but understand that there is a place in the community for them, for us, that there's something that we can do for the community, and that the community should feel like there's something they can do for us. And it's beyond like trying to match us up, which is nice when it happens, but it seldom does happen. Or if it happens with no regard to who we are as individuals, just our marital status. So, which is to say, none. Single person. You guys should get together and But I think that there's more to there has to be more to connecting Jewishly than through the lens of marriage and children, because the reality is, if that's all there is, then speaking very candidly for me, then there's nothing in Judaism for me, and I don't believe that that's true. So then how do I bridge that gap, and how does a synagogue or any community bridge that gap without seeming condescending or like they're taking pity on me? Like, I don't want pity. And it'd be nice to be invited to Shabbat lunch, even though you hear a lot of people saying, well, I only want to invite you when I have other single people there, which is very nice, but it's not what everybody needs. Some people just need to have their status not pointed out to them at every moment of the day. And then there's some people who say, I would invite you, but it's going to be mostly families with kids. And so, sometimes that might not be what we want, but we wouldn't mind it sometimes. Maybe we like kids. Maybe we like you, and we want to get to know your kids. So, I think as in all things, it's not about treating an entire demographic as homogeneous, because everybody's different and everybody has different needs. Just like, I don't really necessarily want to make the parallel between somebody who's in a grief process or in a life after loss, or somebody who's single. But the reality is that there are commonalities in the way they're treated by the traditional Jewish community, and the way they should be approached should be similar, is that it should be individual. Like, sure, there should be like a process when you're dealing with grief. Like, there is definitely a process where people come into your house and they set everything up so you don't have to think about anything, and they put in the low chairs that you're supposed to sit on during Shiva, and all that stuff is taken care of. But then after the Shiva, after 7 days or however many days, I understand there are communities in which you only observe 1 or 2 or 3 days of Shiva, that after Shiva is over, where is the structure for community support? And that structure doesn't exist, which I think is an opportunity to react to people and not like people who are going through this particular stage of human experience. And I think that there's an analog there to single people who are,
There's something embedded in your answer, and I think in the question, that really kind of pulls to the surface the difference between synagogue programs and people in relationships and community, and that those designing for one or the other, it's not the same. And that in many synagogues, Wendy, speaking to your question, I think that there are a lot of programs that are designed for families and for kids. And so there's these natural places to plug in.
Right.
And if you're looking at a synagogue community as a set of programs that you can come to, then there's going to be a challenge there, right? Like a lot of synagogues are having a hard time engaging singles and young couples without kids, for example, because there's not that natural place to plug in. But if you change the lens to be more about relationships and community, then those defining attributes aren't as defining, right? We're talking to people as individuals. I was speaking with a woman who is involved at the Greenberg Hebrew Center, I think, or is what it's called, in New York, and they've completely redesigned their process of being a caring community. And instead of having a small committee of people who help out at Shiva and bring meals and bring soup over to somebody who's sick and organize meals when somebody has a new baby, and that there's kind of this standardized protocol, that they have really worked at individualizing the way that the community can support that person, including who's making the phone calls and reaching out and bringing food. Is it just some random person who signed up, or is it somebody that you have some connection to? And calling the person and asking what they really do need and want. And by asking those questions and by listening, they're finding all sorts of things, like everybody brings food and flowers during Shiva, and I have plenty of company during Shiva. It's 2 weeks afterwards, when all of that has died down and I've eaten everything through my refrigerator. That's the point where having a visit from a friend or having somebody bring over some food would really make an important difference.
Right.
And so really, as you said, seeing people as individuals and caring for them as such. And sometimes that means asking questions and listening, not just making assumptions.
Yeah, and I think in particular with the post-grief, the post-Shiva example is very poignant, and something that I think that we all get very caught up with, when someone dies, and we try to support that person through the funeral and the Shiva, and that's the flurry of the activity, and then afterwards there's a silence, which for a while is okay, because there's so much sensory overstimulation during Shiva, where people come in and come in from all points of your life, and you haven't seen them in 20 years, and they're there, and what are they saying? And so there's all of that goes on, and I have tremendous stories about that period as well. And I do want to get back to virtual Shiva, so remind me if we don't get there. But then afterwards, I started getting emails from people who were saying, things like, "I'm sorry I didn't make it to the funeral," or I'm sorry that I couldn't come to Shiva, or "I'm sorry that I didn't email you during Shiva." And I'm like, don't be sorry. This is perfect. This is coming at exactly the right time, because the way, if you think about it, if it was just an in-person community structure, it would be over at the end of Shiva. And yeah, obviously you can extend the grief conversation by going to Minyan every day, like I did, here in LA. But I saw Shiva in New Jersey, where I hadn't lived in basically 20 years, and then I came back to LA, and I thought about having what I would have called West Coast Shiva in my mind, but then I was like, I don't want to do that again. Am I crazy? I can hear my mother yelling at me, "What are you, crazy? Don't do a second Shiva." So those things. Definitely, but I wanted to connect to the community here also. So there was the question of how was I going to feel comfortable doing that? How was I going to both engage with my community here and allow them to comfort me in a way that wasn't oppressive or wasn't as all-encompassing as the week of Shiva was in New Jersey. But I'll get back to virtual Shiva. So so in terms of, I talked about my online community before, and so the way my days ran in New Jersey after the funeral is I would sit Shiva, from whenever it was in the morning, when we had a morning service in the house, 7:30 or so in the morning. Then we would receive people all day for Shiva, people in and out of the house, with crazy stories to boot. And again, you know, people I hadn't seen in 20 years, and I had to identify them based on a memory 2 decades earlier because they didn't identify themselves when they walked in. So like those kinds of things that were challenging. And then at the end of the day, we'd do another minion in the evening, 7:45, maybe till 8, and then people would stick around until like 9 o'clock. 9 o'clock in New Jersey, you know, I would log into Skype and take calls from people in the UK, people in Israel who wanted to check in. Also, obviously, a lot of wishes came in via email and Facebook, and so I would check those as well. And so it was kind of like a very intense period in terms of like the number of people who reached out. And there were times that I'd definitely turn off the computer and just go to sleep because it's, you know, you got to do that. It's an exhausting day. But for the most part, this engaging in the virtual Shiva was a bidirectional mode of connection and comfort for me. And I hope for those people to be able to ask me, you know, how was I feeling? What was going on? What did Shiva in that house look like? What was my plan once I got back to LA? You know, would I be coming to Israel soon? Would I be coming to the UK soon? Like all of those questions were very normalizing and very anchoring. So, you know, anybody who says that online community isn't real community can come over to me, and I will explain to them gently why they are incorrect. So.
Yeah. Ruvain has a great question. When sharing of grief in social media attains a life of its own, it's forever online and public, does it interfere with the kind of natural process of moving on that one has? You know, you've talked about the Jewish customs of 7 days and 30 days and 1 year. And when there's this ongoing thing online, how does that change your sense of time or process or moving forward?
That's a great question. You know, there are a lot of people who have expressed concern about the fact that I'm still like writing about this stuff, living this stuff, you know, kind of explaining this stuff. And I don't see it that way. I mean, I feel like most days I'm a pretty well-adjusted person who has this loss that makes her sad. And it does pop up from time to time, and it's unexpected, but I don't think that's a function of my processing it in writing. And the fact that it's out there and can comfort anybody at any time, even, you know, 10, 15 years from now, when maybe I've written another book about something completely different, you know, then, you know, I think that's very comforting to me. I mean, I've been lucky enough to have people who have read things I've written over the years tell me how much it meant to them. And you don't hear that often. Usually it's like, great post, or, you know, or we hate you and here's why. You're, you know, if somebody hates you and thinks you're a racist, they'll tell you, but if they really enjoy your piece, they might not hear about it. So that's the sad truth of being a writer. So so when I meet somebody in person and you know, somebody said to me, you know, you got me through my divorce, and I said, dear God, how? And like that wasn't an intention at all, and that was when I was not even writing about grief or loss or anything like that. She said that she used to come to my blog to get like a dose of sunshine, and I was like, okay, well, I'm so glad that worked for you. And the fact that I was real and I was, you know, speaking honestly, but I was also trying to share things that made me happy and share things that I thought were funny, and to help bring laughter to other people. And that's really one of the things that I like to do as well. Like even all this grief stuff, if you want to talk about all this grief stuff and, you know, put it aside, like I still have other things that I want to share with the world, and observations and things that I want to introduce as conversation starters, really, because I don't believe that I have the last word on anything. I wouldn't want to have the last word on anything. You know, to drop the mic and leave. Like I don't want to do that. Like I want to.
Well, our time is almost up, so you may drop the mic and just leave.
Drop the mic and I'll leave. Right.
Plan your big finish now. It's coming. No, really, we only have a couple minutes left. So if there are any questions from any folks who are participating live, feel free to add them to the Q&A or tweet them in now. As we finish, I just wanted to, I'm glancing at my Twitter feed to see if any questions are coming in that way too. I did want to bring up one other piece, which you and I have talked about, that we both have friends who passed away, and that their Facebook profiles have become kind of this living memorial. And the difference in terms of your experience as somebody who is grieving, of visiting a grave and putting a stone on a grave as a marker of, I'm thinking about you, versus coming to somebody's Facebook profile and saying something, thinking about them, reflecting, and that it's not only that one-to-one experience, but it can also be a communal experience, because many people are going there over time. And I'm curious what you think about that, or how it's you've experienced it personally.
Well, thank you for bringing that up. So a friend of mine, Dave Burnett, who I knew when he was an exuberant 22-year-old and was going through ROI at the same time that I was there, the ROI community, roicommunity.org. So Dave was this unbelievable, unstoppable force of nature, except that he then died in a fall in Petra, very tragically, and we were just, grief-stricken. And he was from Australia, and, most of us that he knew from ROI were all over the world, with some people in Australia, obviously, but a group of us gathered in New York to do like a memorial drinks in, to remember him. But what was really interesting for us was this online space where his Facebook wall became this place where everybody came to say goodbye, to say we miss you, buddy, to say, things like, I remember the lessons that you taught me. And somebody wrote, and I still remember it because it just struck me. He said that, that he woke up, that he was dreaming, or that he was wondering what to do about something, and he was tormented about it, and he went to sleep, and then he woke up, and then he thought of Dave, and that he suddenly feels like he knows what to do. And to kind of point to these people who, for lack of a better term, are kind of like angels in our lives, that we can still visibly connect to the life that they had before they left it, and to see that other people are also grieving. And in some ways, this concept of putting a stone on a grave, to show that you were there is a little bit like, not to, bring it down a level, but to like say it's like a like, except it doesn't have a name attached to it. Like, you can't, like, this stone was put here by Lisa, this stone was put here by Esther. But when you do that on Facebook, it does leave a marker. And if you add a comment and you engage with the space in a different way, then you can say, this is a concrete way that somebody made an impact on me, which is, in some ways, that concrete way is better than a stone. Because it inspires other people to continue on a conversation, and can be a tremendous consolation for the people who are left behind, to know that the loss of their loved one was not just felt by them, but that their impact was felt beyond the immediate family, the immediate people who are grievers, mourners according to Jewish law specifically, that there's a reach and that there's an impact that we can have in the world. And so I think that that's a really, really lovely and powerful way to engage with social media of people who have passed away.
Yeah, beautiful. I had a friend who passed away from breast cancer shortly after her son was born, and people take photos of him and go put it on her Facebook page and say, this is what your son's up to today. Now he's 7 or 8 or 10, Oh, I get choked up just thinking about it. Anyway, it's beautiful. And it's not something that's possible in any other way. So it's a place where social media becomes additive and expansive and deepens an experience for an individual as well as for a community, that I think is really powerful and is worth acknowledging. So we are at the end of our time. Thank you, Esther, for speaking with us today, and thank you to everybody who's been online live with us and submitting questions. This will also be recorded, so it'll be available on the ELI Talks YouTube channel for anyone who wants to watch it in the future. The ELI Talks on air continue next week, next Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern, with Hasidic folk musician Moshe Hecht. His website is moshehecht.com. he'll be talking about finding inspiration in the everyday, how Judaism does that and how he weaves that into his music. Thank you once again, Esther, for being with us today. It was a delight talking with you and learning and hearing about your life and your work and how you inspire others. Keep it up, and we'll see you online.
Thank you, Lisa. Bye, everybody.
Bye.